A key component of the modern world economy, the chemical industry delivers products and innovations to enhance everyday life. It is also an industry in transformation, where chemical executives and workers are delivering growth and industry-changing advancements while responding to pressures from investors, regulators, and public opinion. Discover how leading companies are approaching these challenges here on The Chemical Show. Join Victoria Meyer, president of Progressio Global and host of The Chemical Show, as she speaks with executives across the industry and learns how they are leading their companies to grow, transform, and push industry boundaries on all frontiers. Here's your host, Victoria Meyer.
Hi, this is Victoria Meyer. Welcome to The Chemical Show. Today, I am speaking with John Richardson, who is a senior consultant at ICIS. John's been on the show a number of times in class, including most recently episode 36. You can go listen to that as he shares his views on what's going on across the chemicals industry, polymers in particular, and with a close view to China and the impacts that the market has. So anyway, John, welcome to The Chemical Show.
Thank you, Victoria.
Yeah. Glad to have you back on. Your episodes, I got to tell you, are always popular. I kind of keep track of which episodes are people listening to, and they're listening to yours, John. So that's a good sign.
We've got a lot of relatives. Yeah.
You and me both. And a lot of friends in the audience that are happy to hear your insights. So recording this here at the end of 2022. And I think if we go all the way back to the beginning of the year, there was this whole expectation that the world and China was going to be coming out of the doldrums, if you will, that were caused by COVID, supply chain disruptions, et cetera. And I don't think we've really seen this. So how is the year manifested from where you're sitting, when you're looking at polymers markets and the European and Asian markets?
Well, Victoria, I think you would have expected some kind of moderation of growth in China anyway, because what people, I think, didn't fully realize was the extent to which China benefited from the pandemic boom. It was all the China in, China out story we talked about before. So all the chemicals and polymers going to China, re-exported as durable goods we were buying in lockdown in the rich world. So you always expected a moderation of growth, but you'd expect growth still to be very positive, and of course a much bigger base of tons. So people were saying China's going to get stronger. I didn't really get that, because how could it get stronger relative to what was already a fantastic 2021, 2020? Right? That
True.
Didn't make sense. And of course, what none of us foresaw was zero COVID from March onwards. You already had the structural slowdown in the Chinese economy. We can talk about that later, called common prosperity, that meant that China's growth was going to be lower over the longer term. Right? We had the deleveraging of the real estate sector, which is worth 29% of GDP. And you can look at our data at ICIS and you see that a lot of chemical demand growth since 2009 has been driven by that real estate sector, the tremendous demand growth, leading China to have a bigger share globally than it had before, much bigger. So we knew that trend was working through as they push for more income equality, better capital allocation away from speculative property. So that was going to moderate growth as well over time. But bang, zero COVID. And the government is now, well, through the year, I thought, hold on, they cannot relax zero COVID because the effectiveness of Chinese vaccines wanes over time.
Yeah.
So if you have
really quickly, what zero COVID is. So zero COVID was this policy that China had of no COVID transmissions. All right. So from the outside looking in, all it meant to me was really just even more and more shutdowns whenever there was a case. What did zero COVID mean to China?
It meant we're going to have zero cases. We're going to aim to eradicate the disease, not live with it. So Anthony Fauci is just resigning, isn't he? He's retiring. And he said today in the FT, it makes no sense whatsoever, because you can't eradicate the virus, right?
Yeah, this is not a disease like, let's just say, polio, where there was a global process to eradicate polio, which is mostly cholera or something else. Yeah, COVID is a very different disease or virus, I guess.
Well, it's not serious to start with. I mean, yes, it's killed a lot of people, underestimating how terrible it is, but compared with cholera, and it can't be eradicated, you have to live with it. But China said we're going to eradicate it. And the problem is twofold. First, Chinese vaccines, the Sinovac, the effectiveness wanes over time, whereas the mRNA vaccines, the overseas vaccines, it lasts longer. They've got very low vaccination rates among the over 60s and the over 80s, right? Because they're stuck at home, can't get to vaccine centres for whatever reasons. They're very low vaccination rates, and of course, they're the most vulnerable. And they will not import foreign vaccines. That's the problem. And the healthcare system, if they suddenly said tomorrow, right, we're going to get rid of zero COVID tomorrow. I mean, everyone's getting excited about this a few weeks ago. They're relaxing the quarantine regulations, weren't they? Markets went crazy. I think it's Fudan University estimated there will be 1.5 million deaths from an exit wave. And the hospitals are not equipped to cope with the number of serious cases in the context of the waning effectiveness of vaccines. So that was clear really from April this year. See that from just reading the medical journals. And so when people said zero COVID is going to come to an end, there'll be a massive boom in chemicals demand, there's no doubt that will happen. Right? When they get past zero COVID, it'll go great. Chemical markets will boom as people come out and spend lots of money. Zero COVID means you're locked down in your condo. The restaurants are shut, the shops are shut. You're sometimes almost frightened to go out in case you get picked up and taken to a government quarantine centre. I've got good friends in Shanghai. It's like that. I don't know, should I go out? For a while, there's a real problem delivering stuff to people's condos because the delivery drivers didn't want to go to a different suburb because the zero COVID rules vary by different districts. So you think you're finding your own district, move to another district, and you end up taken off to a government quarantine centre because the rules are quite arbitrary. Because the local officials are trying to please Beijing by being extra zealous. And it's almost like we don't worry about the economic damage. But the issue is, how did they get past this? Well, first of all, they need to do something about vaccinations, right? It's a big issue. Yeah. Secondly, they need to prepare for that exit wave by investing a fortune in hospitals. And as I said, throughout the year, I was saying, we're not going to end zero COVID anytime soon. People say, yes, they're going to end it. And we've seen with the data on the chemicals markets, now look at polyolefins, as you know, progressively through the year, we've seen with the net import numbers and our estimates of local production that we're moving to negative growth or flat growth across the polyolefin. LDP being the worst, but that's to do with other reasons, to do with its relative expense. It's very expensive LDP versus linear low. Right. Linear low minus 2%, polypropylene might just get to 1% this year growth, possibly, or flat. HGP minus 2% thing, and then LDP minus 6%, which is third year of decline it will be. That's what the latest data is suggesting. At the start of the year, people said, we're looking at 6 to 7% growth across linear H and PP. Maybe low is going to be weak. People accepted that. So this is a massive change from expectations. And we're getting almost end of the year now, aren't we, with the data?
So how much is that, when you think about the growth or the negative growth, the losses, I guess, retraction, is about export versus domestic demand in China, right? And I know that's kind of hard to measure because a lot of stuff's getting produced into goods and then getting shipped. So where is this really a function, not just of moderation globally, but really just the whole zero COVID in China and shutting down the domestic economy?
I think it started with the domestic economy. I think it's that loss of consumer confidence. And I must mention the property bubble as well, which the government put option was that we will never let land prices and property prices fall. So that was in place for 20 years. So people would invest in property, second or third, fourth properties, some very rich people, and they would buy land even though the property hadn't been built on the assumption the developer will be fine financially because the government would always rescue the property developers. And that's gone because land prices and home prices are falling. So that's a big factor as well, which you mentioned. It's the loss of domestic. As I said, you can really link that booming stimulus since 2009 into chemicals demand, and most of that stimulus went into real estate. So you saw China really take off in terms of global share of consumption of chemicals and polymers. So it's domestic, people not willing to spend money, shut at home. For a while, I think at least they couldn't get the deliveries of the stuff online, and that's a lot of packaging, a lot of internet packaging. I think more lately, we still saw reasonable export growth, I think certainly in pricing, because of course prices went up. But we're now seeing, I think, significant volume falls of Chinese exports, which is 20% of GDP. That's more recently, I think, last few months, couple of months. Two things there. Logistics problems still around the Guangdong province, enormous export processing province, Guangdong, for example. They've got some lockdowns there again. And of course, you've got the inflation in the West, which is now affecting an inevitable cycle out of durable goods demand post-pandemic as people have bought washing machines You buy a washing machine once every few years. You probably brought that purchase forward, didn't you, when you had government stimulus? So that's affecting that 20% of the. So it's getting worse because of that the export slowdown last couple of months, I think.
We'll be right back. At Ecovist, they're accelerating the transition to a sustainability-driven future. Their long history of innovation, expertise, and customer collaboration supports the development of proprietary catalysts and services across their two industry-leading businesses, Advanced Materials and Catalysts and Eco Services. Advanced Materials and Catalysts is a leader in proprietary and customized technologies for polymers, cleaner fuels, emissions control, and circularity. Eco Services is the largest North American recycler of spent sulfuric acid. Ecovist, your catalyst for positive change.
Interesting. So so when we think about just what has happened, what other surprises were there? If we look at where the year started and where the year is ending, are there any other surprises that have changed polyethylene, polypropylene in Europe and Asia? And then I guess the effect is globally, right? Because it's a global market effectively.
I think the biggest surprise for me was that I thought China was doing a really good job on the pandemic, and it's not. And that surprised me. And that really from March onwards, April, you start to say, just read the medical journals and you will see that they have not been doing a good job on the vaccine on the pandemic, because of the weakness of Chinese vaccines and the politics of importing foreign vaccines. To me, that was a big surprise. A second big surprise is the extent to which China has cut operating rates. And normally we haven't seen that, because China runs hard to keep people in jobs in the washing machine factory downstream. It's not about profitability. You can see that from the spreads versus the operating rates over time. The data tell us that. But suddenly dawned on me, well, it's not about profitability, it's about demand. There simply isn't enough demand. So they have to cut. If you can't sell it, you can't produce it, can you?
Yeah.
So it's not about profits, which are off the charts weak. I mean, polypropylene margins were $185 a ton negative last week for injection grade in Northeast Asia. It's simply the fact there's no demand. And what's further surprising to me is, despite big cuts in particularly polypropylene production, the market is still weak. So that tells you the extent to which demand has been affected in China.
Yeah. John, how much of this is affected by the Russia-Ukraine conflict that has been ongoing for most of the year?
I think then you could turn the attention, therefore, to Europe more on that, because inflation is not only in China as much, and they're getting cheap Urals crude and stuff like that's helping them here. I mean, looking at Europe, that's big because of the demand destruction downstream in polyolefins, even probably in average shopping basket sizes. People are cutting back on the basics because of the cost of heating in the UK is off the charts higher than it was a year ago and across Europe.
Right.
So people are take the choice of cutting back on essential food shopping and paying the heating bills.
Yeah.
And of course, that's affecting polyolefins demand again. And the durable goods applications into, say, autos is really struggling in Europe.
Hey, Don, how much of this is a function of production cuts because of lack of availability of feedstock or energy in the form of electricity and fuel to power, fuel boilers and what have you? And how much of this is demand destruction, or is it hard to separate?
I mean, at the moment, the gas storage levels in Europe are good. It's been a very mild early winter, and the gas price has more than halved, hasn't it, since its peak? So at the moment, there's not that much pressure on producers in terms of gas costs and supply as there was a few months ago.
Okay.
So it's not a production. We all thought there was a scenario where this winter we'd see major production cutbacks. Even the whole complex, it's a very integrated complex, is closing down. You reach a certain operating rate, you've got to close, haven't you?
Yeah.
And particularly in Germany, where over the years they've moved from fuel oil to gas to fire the furnaces to get to 850 degrees centigrade or whatever it is, very high temperatures. So it's very dependent. Germany's very dependent on Russian gas, not just from the grid, but for the furnaces. But that hasn't transpired. So I think the issue more is demand. And in terms of, yes, the margins have come down, you look at our average variable cost margins for the polyethylenes and polypropylene in Europe, unlike Asia, they're still making money, but they're much lower than they were.
Yeah.
And of course, they've got energy surcharges as well. So they're introducing those surcharges to customers, which may or may not be included in our base price. It's complicated.
Got it.
So
that's a hard one sometimes to factor.
It is. I think it's more of demand destruction at the moment, Victoria, but you talk to our gas team and they're saying that we're not out of the woods yet with this winter. It'll get a lot colder.
Yeah, I mean, it's still early, right? I mean, it's got several more months to go. Yeah.
Yeah, it could get a lot colder. And Russia may reduce gas flows through Ukraine. They're threatening to do that. And there may be a problem in the build-up to next winter, depending on how much demand is reduced and the just lack of LNG supply and regasification terminals and distribution of, I mean, like Spain's got lots of regasification terminals, but no pipelines to link to Northern Europe. So the gas team say, watch for next winter. So I think there's a European production problem for chemicals potentially next winter and possibly later this winter. But at the moment, I see more.
So you think there might be a 1 year delay or 1 year lag in some of these production issues?
I think we've got to watch that. And of course, the other thing for Europe is supply, that obviously people are driving. So the refinery feedstocks are coming back, they're flying. So you get more availability of naphtha as they run kerosene and diesel and gasoline. And the US production, well, it had to be better than last year because last year was the Texas winter storm, your hurricanes. And so they still have those logistics issues that are restricting US exports, which you know very well, the trucks and the rail cars and the warehousing and everything. But you look at the data for polyethylene exports and it's significantly up this year. And you've got new startups, haven't you? So that's kind of easing the supply side of Europe as demand destruction hits at the downstream level. I think one of the things I've been talking a lot about is the incredibly high premiums for Europe and the rest of the world over China.
Yeah. So talk more about that. What are you seeing as premiums? I mean, I think everybody's seeing some premiums and maybe some kind of just more regional market activity as opposed to global driving. But what do you see as some of these differentials or just?
Yeah, it was the container rates being so high and lack of container space. So that meant that oversupply was essentially trapped in Northeast Asia as China was slowing down through 2022. In fact, from April 2021 onwards, China was decelerating versus the peak pandemic demand as supply increased. And that oversupply was trapped, in essence, in Northeast Asia because the big exporters couldn't move that supply to other regions because of the cost and availability of container freight.
Yeah.
And I think Europe was kept tight by the Western Hemisphere, was kept tight by the winter storm, etc., and all the pandemic stimulus that was flowing through economies still then. So, I mean, I'm looking at high-density polyethylene injection grade. The average Northwest European November 2002 to December 2020 premium was $280 a ton. Between 1 January 2021 and the 25th of November last week, $683 a ton. So that's
wow. So it's increase. Almost tripled, or it's gone up 250%. The pricing premium. Yeah.
And the question I keep asking is, will premiums come down to historic long-term levels? And what would that mean for you?
It's a magic question, John. I think everybody wants to know that question.
Yeah. And then you look at India, you look at Pakistan, you look at Vietnam, you look at Peru, Mexico, Brazil, all see the same dynamics, essentially. I think US is a different market. Yeah.
Yeah. So, John, what about the Middle East, right? I mean, for years, Middle East was the low-cost production center. They were the exporters to the world. And yet nobody talks about it anymore. What do you see happening there? Are they still just chugging along quietly? What's changed, if anything?
I think that if you look at Saudi, what's the most important, biggest producer in the Middle East, I mean, looking at polypropylene, they're very diversified in that they're not that dependent on China. You said they've got amazing production costs, haven't they, as you say, but only 6% of their production of polypropylene is dependent on exports to China. Only 6% of their total exports go to China, right? I haven't got the data for Abu Dhabi or Kuwait, but it's really that Saudi position on polypropylene, similar on polyethylene. So they're more diversified. They're sent to more regions. So that's good. But, the problem for them still is the loss of that China market, with polypropylene, China probably becoming a net exporter next year, which is extraordinary because in 2021, it was 42% of total net imports globally going to net exports in 2023. It'd be stunning, wouldn't it? Stunning turnaround. So they would still need to place those other volumes, missing volumes to China in the other big net import markets like Turkey, Europe, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. So, but they're still in a better position than, and it's because of the links with Europe, right? But I think the challenge there for the Middle East is if those European premiums come down and China stays where it is. There's two scenarios for next year, I think. The Middle East have got to think about this, right? Scenario one is to get past zero COVID. And then if European premiums come down over China, so what? Because China's coming up. And China's rising, massive boom in demand. Chemical prices will go really strongly up. No question about it across the board.
Yeah.
If they don't get past zero COVID, oversupply continuing, then those premiums will start coming down. And what does that do to the Middle East profitability, even with the gas advantage? Because they're making so much more money in Europe versus China because of those premiums, right? And in Latin American markets and in Turkey, etc. That's the challenge, I think, for all producers, but even for the feedstock advantage.
So that's scenario one.
Yeah,
what's your scenario two?
Well, I think scenario two is zero COVID comes to an end, as I said, and we're off to the races again. But I still think that you've got to think about common prosperity and structural long-term slowdown in China and its rising self-sufficiency will remain long-term challenges for us. Certainly see a big bounce if they get past it.
So, John, I think this whole topic of structural long-term slowdowns, maybe a strong word, but less demand or flattening of demand. So if we think about some of the drivers going on globally, sustainability, a drive towards circularity, a lot of pressure on producers, especially those that are tied to the stock market, which is, say, the US and European folks, and maybe China less so, although they have some different drivers. Some people would say we should be flattening polymer demand, polyethylene, polypropylene, and yet we still see growth, right? So Shell just started up its big polyethylene plant in the US. And of course, that decision was made years ago. It takes a while to get there. Chevron and Qatar just announced a big investment, right? So there's a lot of investments going on. Where's all the polymer going? Is there really a long-term slowdown? Is the demand shifting in regions? Where's the product going?
A good question. I mean, I'm going to look at our data quickly because this is quite extraordinary. And I thought, is this right? I double checked it and it's right based on our supply and demand database. Let's look at high density polyethylene, right? Between 2000 and 2021, annual capacity in excess of global demand was 4 million tons a year. Between 2022 and 2025, it rises to 11 million tons a year. Polypropylene, 2000 to 2021, 7 million tons a year, 20 million tons a year between 2022 and 2025.
Wow.
So
that's for polypropylene?
Yeah, polypropylene.
Wow.
We talked before the podcast about being the problem child for all other reasons. So these are in enormous numbers and changes. So I think the low carbon thing is really important because the Chevron project with Qatar has highlighted low carbon. The INEOS project at Antwerp is talking about low carbon based on ethane feedstock and the ability to go to green hydrogen if that works out at that same site, and some recycling, some substantial recycling as well. So I think sustainability around, there's also the Canadian project that Dow's planning as well, talks about low carbon with e-crackers, nuclear reactors to power the furnaces and carbon capture and storage, and eventually, hopefully, green hydrogen if that works. All these things, plus separate challenges is recycling plastic rubbish, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe we're talking about a world in which there will be growth, it will be lower, it'll be more regional because Europe will still need to import a lot of polymers. Right? If you look at our data out to 2040, huge amount of linear low, H and PP, low, Europe's a net exporter. So where's it going to come from? Well, if Europe carries on its current course, I don't see any reason why it won't. They might have a carbon border adjustment mechanism. You got the brand owners committed to reducing carbon as well as dealing with plastic waste.
Right.
The producers respond, so the Europe becomes a market which, sets a higher price on carbon or a higher value to reducing carbon. And so that still will be a market that will grow okay, won't it? Long term, you'll still need lots of polymers, right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Is that the play? And will we see less efficient capacity shut down?
Yeah. Does ICIS track that? Do you track as kind of almost a different price set, low carbon polymers or the sources, right? So I would imagine, and maybe there's not enough volume at this point in time to do anything with that, but is that part of your future plans to be able to track, let's just say traditional HDPE and then a low carbon HDPE that's produced via circularity or incorporates other carbon capture, other technologies that make it more sustainable, if you will?
We started to, yeah. We've got a joint venture with a German company called Carbon Mines, right?
Okay.
And we've got our supply and demand database, which has got all the plants and projects in the world. And the Carbon Mines team have the expertise to look at the different technologies, different process technologies. And we've got sort of third-party data upstream to oil and gas extraction, but we look at primarily the polymer plant, and we compare different processes, different technologies in different regions and in different energy sources. So, for example, in China, we know that polypropylene is 11 times worse for carbon if it's coal versus PDH. Although China itself is at a disadvantage globally because it uses most of its energy via coal, right? Full stop.
Right.
For energy. And we know that the US is in a very advantaged position relative to other regions because of the gas-based production, same as the Middle East. So we have the data on every polymer plant in the world, which, is going to be really important information for your converters and processors in Europe and for your brand owners. This is third-party secondary data, so it's Scope 3 emissions. If you're looking at it from the perspective of the downstream companies, right? So that's Scope 3 for them, isn't it? They're suppliers.
Right.
A lot of people will say, well, we have our primary data, and they'll say we know better about our carbon emissions than anybody else. So a big polymer producer will know better. Personally feel that there will be an alignment between primary and secondary data, where individual companies will have their own standards, which is fine, but we need to standardize enough to compare across companies to give it that extra stamp of credibility. I'm not saying it's not credible already. Companies doing a great job, but I think we can make it better and stronger by having international comparisons of carbon. And then you can really start thinking, are we moving in the right direction globally? So I think this is a first step for ICIS, and it will evolve. But it's a good, very good start, I think. And I think this will become critical. You start looking at...
Is that information yet publicly available or available to your customers? Or is it still in development? It is available. Okay.
We have a joint venture with Carbon Mines. And yes, you can subscribe to it through ICIS. Right. So happy to present to any customers who are interested. I'll get the experts from Journey to present, not me. I'm not an expert on this at all, but they can present how it works. But I don't know, Victoria. I do think this may be the logic behind these new projects. And I mean, in Saudi, that they've committed that the next cracker, all future crackers will be low carbon in Saudi. And you've got the SABIC joint venture on e-crackers as well. And certainly any investment in Europe will have to be low carbon, and I think they might be retrofitting old capacity to make it low carbon as well. So is that the future in a more self-sufficient China and a lower growth? So it's interesting to speak to the C-suites and see what they think. But you would think on the surface, logically, why would you announce these big new projects? But I think that's the driver. And the developing world, finally. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't know what the driver. I'm with you on it, John, but I think some of this, the economics don't match up, and some of the announcements are indications as opposed to certainties, right? So there's a lot of hope out there. But, even I've seen different things or hear from different experts, and something like 50% of the technologies that we need to accomplish some of these sustainability targets and carbon targets, et cetera, haven't even been discovered, right? So there's steps in the right direction, but it's not solutions. It's not holistic solutions.
Yeah, and I know that Dow, I think Exxon have talked about the need for a stable carbon pricing regime, or a clear carbon pricing regime, in the US to have carbon capture up in Houston. There's a technology issue, isn't it, as well, Victoria, but the actual regulatory issue as well, I think.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine at some point when there is disparity, the approaches in terms of how products are actually produced, what's produced under low carbon and what's not, that'll further regionalize the markets.
Yeah, and I think CBAM will be a barrier that exporters have to overcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
A standard you have to overcome. And if that does happen, not certainly will happen to chemicals, but possibly by 2026, You certainly, and the big thing again, as always, is China. Because talking about carbon in a big way. And if China were to go for it, and it would fit with the need to escape the middle income trap with the manufacturing value chain and common prosperity is about cleaning up the environment, international commitments to carbon. If they went for it in a big way and started making their chemicals industry low carbon while also pushing our modern recycling industry, which they're already doing to some extent, imagine the effects globally that happened.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I do think, John, though, and this is, maybe we even need to push this into another podcast episode because we're going to run long, as we always do, and that's fine. But I think there's this view that actually China is going to be retiring more people and more workers than they're bringing into the system, right? That the one-child regime, as it's managing and controlling population, that China population is actually going to decline. So when I think about some of the low carbon technologies and where they fit, not necessarily in polymers, but if you think about more broadly across the chemical industry, a lot of it is actually far less efficient. So how China is able to bring on the low carbon technologies that maybe are less efficient at a time when the workforce is diminishing as well. What does it do? Is it going to happen? Or is there maybe that drives innovation in a different solution?
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's a separate subject, but then you get onto how global regulations develop. If we end up with a global price on carbon, it moves the cost curve sufficiently, then it would work for China, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's true. You know what? You're right. That's what changes the game is the carbon price and the shifting.
And they could make it domestically. They could do a lot to do that. And if they were then demanding low carbon imports, and they'll still have to import a lot of polyethylene. I mean, I've talked about self-sufficiency, but for the polyethylenes, they'll still be a big importer for the next 20 years, right. We think. Well, I suppose a big growth in recycling might reduce those imports, absolutely, but it might be we'd only take it from low carbon sources. That would reinforce that, wouldn't it? The local producers would then match their own CBAM, wouldn't they, in terms of price premiums, maybe.
Lots of changes in the future.
Yeah, so I'd love to speak to the CEOs of Chevron and Dow. Maybe they'll talk to us on the next podcast.
Yeah, there we go. There we go, John. That would be good. Get some insights. So let's bring it back closer to home. We are about to enter 2023. What's your prediction? What should we be looking for over the next year?
A razor-like focus on the government messaging about zero COVID. Any reports you can get your hands on the extent to which they've bridged the gap in terms of healthcare provision, in terms of sufficient vaccinations for the over 60s and over 80s. Because be careful what you wish for. If they suddenly said zero COVID is over, then you get this big exit wave. So you can't see that being a benefit, can you? Go backwards, you go forwards and backwards, wouldn't you, very quickly? Yeah. So that's the key, because then the savings rates are very high in China. People are not spending money. You think the willingness to spend money when zero COVID ends will be tempered by the end of the property bubble, true, but people will still come out and spend money. And this is very difficult, but we've got to talk about it. Political unrest in China, social unrest, as we've seen the last few days. We need to watch that very closely, because now there's been some really serious issues in Shanghai. So, but I'd say in terms of chemical prices, watch zero COVID. In terms of Europe, watch demand destruction versus the support that will be offered to pricing, if that's the right term, by energy-related production cutbacks. I mean, obviously, it wouldn't do much for the profitability of producers, but it would certainly support the markets, wouldn't it, in a, I suppose, negative way. And I suppose the other thing to watch out is how the US is able to export your logistics issues, because you've got a lot more polymers and you're moving to a stronger net export position on polypropylene, because there's new projects coming on stream next few years. So I think you're already a net exporter, aren't you? But it's increasing, isn't it, over the next couple of years? Yeah. So that's something else to watch, and how that affects the global market.
Yeah. And where do we see inflation in all of this?
Good news, I think. I was reading again the Financial Times this morning that it looks like, container freight rates now, the FT say, are back towards pre-pandemic levels. It's 5 times higher, according to their estimate. Maybe not on all routes, but average. I think the high oil prices are a cure for high oil prices, aren't they? So we've got demand destruction.
Yes, they are.
Case. I think there was the danger of more geopolitically driven energy disruptions, which could add to the energy costs. They're still very high, but we seem to be past peak inflation, I'm hoping. So that's a positive thing. Maybe towards the middle of next year, end of next year, we see that inflation pressure coming off in the West, and that will support some recovery. But going back to polymers, Victoria, we just have a huge amount of overcapacity. And, that 2020-25 period, you would say 2022 to 2025 period I was talking about, we have 20 million tons a year of overcapacity in polypropylene, which is a record high. You'd think that most of the steel is in the ground, wouldn't you, for that period? If you're
yes, I would assume that most of that is on its way being built.
Well, so it has to happen. We have out to 2022, 2030, we have 80 million tons of surplus capacity, but you would think a lot of that could get postponed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's always the opportunity for rationalization, for assets shutting down. Kind of depends on where they are in terms of location and how they fit on the cost curve, right? Because that's the other solution to overcapacity, is just getting rid of capacity.
I think so. And we've been talking about some of the stuff, I suppose, Northeast Asian asset, ex-China, being under pressure for many years.
Yeah.
So we may see some rationalization there. Not sure about Europe. It's interesting whether some of the older crackers there might be under pressure.
Maybe. I mean, they've rationalized a lot of them already. So I don't know what's left to rationalize.
Maybe not much, but something has to give. These are extraordinary numbers. Maybe debottleneckings. We need to go through our project database, I think, and see what is new, what's really happening, what's a debottlenecking that could be delayed, and then maybe some net numbers versus some scenarios where we could reduce that oversupply, I think. As you say, also rationalization.
Well, and I would imagine, depending on how some of these advanced recycling projects develop, capacity is not always capacity, John, right? So some capacity actually operates much slower depending on what's being produced. So it's not clear to me how some of that's playing out and if that will have an effect as well on net capacity.
Yeah, we prorate it over a few years. And I think we're looking at the US projects, and you've got 120 this year, 320 next year, up to 1 million tons, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
And that might be staggered more conservatively, I guess.
Yeah. Probably. It's easy to announce, it's harder to build.
Yeah. And then harder to operate under these conditions. Harder to build as well as an issue. We may have issues around building as well as operating, the technical issues around building and starting up on schedule.
Yeah.
I mean, the big issue is China's, which one is it? I think it's polypropylene. Now, one of the polymers, I'm not going to say which one it is, there's another 16% capacity increase next year.
That's a lot.
Which one it is, I can't recall. So they're going to have to think very hard now, aren't they? Because it's all well and good. We want to be the exporter of, say, polypropylene, but where are they going to sell it? And at what netbacks? Especially if the netbacks and the netbacks are falling. China's polypropylene exports have been going up, and then they've started coming down since April because the netbacks are coming down because China pricing is dragging the rest of the world close to its level, you see. So that will have an effect next year, and they'll maybe moderating their anyway, our base case operating rates for China polymers are the lowest we've seen since 2000, our estimates for next year. So like 79%, 77%, 78%, very low operating rates.
Yeah.
Which reflects, I think, the economics. So something has to give, doesn't it? We get back into balance.
Maybe that's the theme for 2023. Something has to give.
Yeah.
Good. Well, time will tell. Well, John, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. I appreciate having you on The Chemical Show, sharing your insights once again.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And thanks, everyone, for listening. We will talk to you again next time.
Thank you.
We've come to the end of today's podcast. We hope you enjoyed your time with us and want to learn more. Simply visit thechemicalshow.com for additional information and helpful resources. Join us again next time here on The Chemical Show with Victoria Meyer.